going to kick off. I think there might be a few people joining as we go. So you're very welcome. I'm Sarah Keogh, I'm dietitian with Celiac Society, and today we are going to talk about child nutrition and fussy eating. And the reason we sort of have this session is that when we work with a lot of children with celiac disease, you have all the issues of taking out gluten, but then you might have a child who's fussy as well, and people can end up quite restricted. But you don't have to have celiac disease for a child to be a bit of a fussy eater. So we just want to go through some of the key nutrients that we would see as being issues for children with celiac disease or without, and then look at how we might tackle some fussy eating with it. I will have time for questions at the end, and we'll stop and have a chat if you have any then. Please feel free to put any questions up into the chat as well, and I'll keep an eye on that as we go through. So where do we start? So probably one of the most significant vitamins we will talk about for celiac disease in general, but also for just kids, is vitamin D. We know that studies are showing that 95 to 97% of toddlers are not actually hitting targets for vitamin D in their diets. And, in an ideal world, children, all of us are supposed to get vitamin D from the sun, but let's face it, we're not exactly famous for our sunshine in Ireland. So we do know that lots of adults and children do have lower levels of vitamin D. So we would look at children supplementing with vitamin D, or eating foods that are fortified with vitamin D. So you can often see some milks have vitamin D added, and they can actually be brilliant, particularly for kids, because you're not trying to get them to take a supplement or a tablet. But for adults as well, a supplement is going to be really useful. You will get vitamin D in foods like oily fish. You will get some in eggs, but I would always see those as a top up to your vitamin D rather than the main source, because even with those foods, you'd have to be eating quite a lot of them to actually get all of your vitamin D regularly. Now, if your child who eats salmon several times a week, they're going to be fine. But the amounts that particularly younger children will eat are quite small. So it's really worth looking at, milk that has vitamin D added, or looking at a supplement. And there's lots of supplements for kids, little spray ones. Some of them are happier kind of with the tablets, there's chewable ones and so on. And we do have a list of gluten-free vitamin D supplements in the food list. The other big nutrient, and this one that turns up a lot, is issues around iron. And as we know, for a lot of people, if they consistently have low iron, about 40% of those people will turn out to actually have celiac disease. But in children, low iron, it can be a bit of an issue even before you look at anything else like celiac disease. So you will see that we've research showing that around 20% of 1-year-olds and maybe around 10% of 2 to 3-year-olds are not eating enough iron. But this actually gets worse as they get older. So we know around half of maybe 12-year-old girls not eating enough iron, and a big jump to maybe 3/4 of teenage girls not eating enough iron. Boys tend to get a little bit bigger and eat bigger portions, so they tend to get away with the iron a little bit more with that. But it is still an issue for boys and girls to keep an eye on it. And what's really important is that kids are getting lots of iron-rich foods. And I think foods like red meat, we're very famous for being rich in iron. But a lot of people are nervous a little bit about red meat, or maybe moving away from it. Red meat is absolutely fine to have 3 times a week. We know even when people talk about cancer and bowel cancer and red meat, really the focus is on processed red meats like ham and bacon and those kind of foods. We do see a very slight increased risk in colon cancer in people who are eating those foods every day. So it's not recommended that kids in particular have the processed meats a lot, but ordinary red meat, if you're making a spaghetti bolognese, something like that, that's actually fine for kids certainly to have 3 times a week. There's no issue around that. In terms of chicken then, if you look at things like chicken, turkey, those almost all of the iron there is actually in the chicken and turkey legs. There's actually very little iron in chicken breast. And I think this is one of the reasons, and I see it quite a lot in the clinic, where kids are not eating enough iron because a lot of their meat is chicken breast. Now, chicken breast is brilliant for protein. It's brilliant for B12. It's a good food, but it has very little iron. And, the average 5-year-old would actually have to eat well over 20 chicken breasts a day to actually get the amount of iron that they need. So I said chicken breast, great for other things, but if they are having chicken for dinner and it's mainly chicken breast, you need to have something else on the plate that actually is going to give the child some iron. So really just watch that one. Or go for the chicken legs, they work really well as well. Get a little bit of iron in oil-rich fish. Shellfish actually have a little bit. 2 fish to call out for iron would be mussels, if kids like them, and some do. Sardines are also really a good source of iron, and mackerel will have a little bit of iron as well. On the other side, then we have for want of a better term, sort of vegetable iron. And this is a slightly different type of iron that you find in vegetables. Now, your body uses it just beautifully as well. So your green leafy vegetables, but really 2 in particular, it's cabbage, spinach and kale. really would be the three. You know, I often hear people talk about broccoli and things like that. There's a tiny bit of iron in there, but you know, one serving of broccoli a day is not going to cover the iron needs for an awful lot of kids. So you're looking, spinach would be quite good, kale is quite good, and with cabbage, it's the darker green outer leaves that really have the most iron. The yellow bit in the middle, it tends to go down a little bit as you get into that. Luckily, beans and lentils are really, really good sources of iron. Red lentils and brown lentils in particular are brilliant, and they can go into soups, you can put them into casseroles. You know, there's lovely ways to start adding those in. Curries, you know, like lentil curries, that, you know, dal, the Indian lentil curry, which is gorgeous. And then a lot of vegetarian dishes based on things like beans and lentils would be fantastic. But things like, I find with kids, we often get you know, if we have kids in the celiac society who are struggling with iron, we often get them to do recipes like roasted chickpeas, which are very easy to make, and they have loads of iron in them. Kids pop them; they're kind of like a crunchy treat, and they actually do like them, which is fantastic. Pumpkin seeds, almonds, hazelnuts, nuts and seeds are also going to be good sources of iron, and they can be ground up. You know, for younger children, so you're not worried about them choking on nuts and things like that. And again, they can go into breakfast cereal, put them in with yogurt, they go over salads. If you're making bread, actually you can add them in there as well, and that is going to bump up the iron. Fortified foods are also going to be important. It is one of the big problems for celiac disease is that the major source of iron actually in the Irish diet is fortified breakfast cereals, because a lot of breakfast cereals have iron added. But most of those, when you go to the gluten-free version, they don't always have the iron added as well. So it actually is a big gap in iron for a lot of people who are on a gluten-free diet. So it's looking at, if you can, if you are buying gluten-free breakfast cereals, are there ones that have iron added to look for? And again, you could be adding those seeds and nuts and so on to cereals just to bump up the iron with that. Eggs are also going to be a good source of iron, but it's all in the egg yolk. So it's the yellow part of the egg that has the iron. So they're all foods to be thinking about adding in through the day. The thing is, you need to be eating 2 to 3 foods a day from this list to actually be hitting targets for iron. So I know sometimes people look at this and go, well, I do that a few times a week. It's like, no, it needs to be something that's done a little bit more often, just to keep the iron coming in all the time for the kids. The other nutrients that we would always talk about for children would be omega-3 fats, and these are particularly a type called DHA. And DHA is a very special type of omega-3, which is actually in huge amounts in your brain, and it's really important for brain development in children. In adults, really important for maintaining brain health as we get older. But low levels, you know, seem to be an issue. So we know that, again, toddlers are not eating a huge amount of this DHA that we need. We need between, just depending on age, 100 to 250 milligrams a day. We know the average intake in Ireland is around 70 milligrams a day in toddlers. And we know that around toddlers and young children, only about 15% are eating oil-rich fish like salmon. And it's funny, in research, kids up to about the age of 1 year actually do quite well on fish. And it seems as soon as they come off sort of the baby food recipes and onto the family meals, it's as if the fish just falls down a little bit with that. So it'd be a nice thing just for kids to really look at getting the oily fish in. And that's really what you're talking about, is your salmon, trout, mackerel, herring, sardines. And like everything, the younger you get kids eating these foods, they're normal, and then they can work with them. But don't always think about just putting a lump of fish out, because a lot of kids aren't going to go for that. They do great in fish pies, fish fingers, and you can make homemade fish fingers with kind of salmon darns and things like that. And, you know, it's amazing how a lot of kids don't notice. They just go, oh, it's fish fingers, and go with that. So, you know, even pâtés, you know, things like that made with things like smoked mackerel and so on are just good ways to start getting kids eating more fish. Now, you will get omega-3s in nuts and seeds, and I always mention them here because I know if someone goes off and Googles omega-3s, these will pop up. Although nuts and seeds do have omega-3, the type of omega-3 you find in nuts and seeds is different to the type that you get in fish. And although it has great uses elsewhere in the body, we don't see the same brain benefits from plant omega-3s that we see from the fish omega-3s. And this is why the fish side of things is actually so important. Now, nuts and seeds, as I said, are fantastic for lots of other things, but I really would be leaning into getting kids, try if you can, to get them to eat a little bit of fish as well. So they're kind of the main 3 nutrients that we would see consistently as a problem. But as people always say to me, we can say great things about nutrition for kids, but actually, how do you get them to eat it? And so I want to talk to you today about some different aspects of fussy eating and how we can manage with that. So what is fussy eating? So, you know, usually it's a phase. A lot of kids will go through a phase where they refuse to eat certain things, or they refuse to eat a whole lot. For most kids, it lasts less than a month. It usually hits in around the age of 2, but lasts less than a month. It can be quite mild, where they just don't want to eat a few things, to being quite severe. Usually, not always, usually it doesn't affect overall nutrition. And that's a very reassuring thing for a lot of parents, that if you have a fussy child, it generally doesn't. We don't generally see big nutrient deficiencies with it. It depends on how restricted the child is. And the thing I'd always say, when, particularly when I'm talking to parents, is it's normal for children to dislike some foods. And I'd always say, at least 5 foods. Kids can have 5 foods they just don't like. There's some people who hate celery or hate cucumber, or they just don't like, and it's okay. And it's nice for kids to have a little bit of control and say, actually, I really don't like that, and that's fine. So it's only when they kind of get into avoiding a lot of foods where we would start to look at it as being fussy eating. And, what are the causes? Many causes. Any kind of illness. So if a child's been quite sick, you would see people whose kids were eating great and then they had a tummy bug and they had a few days of throwing up, and then you're nearly back to square one in terms of getting them to start eating properly again. We do see more fussy or picky eating in children with food allergies or food intolerance, things like celiac disease, where they're a little nervous of certain foods because, they'll have been told, don't eat that and don't eat that and don't share with this child and don't swap your lunch in school. And there can be a little bit of fear around food that can actually make children and I would often call it's not what we call true fussy eating in terms of being problems with texture, but there's a fear around food that's actually making them a little bit nervous about trying. If children have had a choking incident or they had a really bad gagging incident, they got a fright, for some kids that can really set them off. But also if children have a very strong sense of smell or taste, the intensity of the flavors can be too much for them, or if they have a strong sense of touch, the feel of the food in the mouth can be quite difficult. Lack of variety during weaning, both in terms of textures and foods, can play into it. If parents are fussy eating as well, actually, it tends to travel. There's a question, is it genetic, or did they just learn that from a parent who also has issues around food? So there's lots, and I'm sure we can all find more reasons for it. The question is, when is it a problem? So if it's normal for some kids to have a phase where they don't eat a huge amount of food, when does it become a problem? The big one is if they're not actually hitting nutrition needs. And sometimes we see the big cases hitting the headlines. There was a child very sadly went blind there. I think 2 years ago, I saw the case in the papers, and he had such a restrictive diet that he'd missed out on vitamin B12, which is very important for nerves, which is a lot of part of the eyes. So if kids aren't meeting needs for nutrition, if their iron is low, if their protein is low, if their B12 is low, whatever it is, then that's when it's actually a problem and we need to sort of do something about it. But also if children have very, very restricted foods, and you might say, well, look, if they're getting a bit of everything, is that okay? But sometimes with kids who are very restricted, like if they're really a very limited number of foods, they can actually over time cut out even more and more of those. And especially we'll see some kids that it's not just the rice cake, it's the particular brand of the rice cake. And then if the brand changes the recipe or goes out of business, you then lose that food as well. So if they have a very restricted number of foods, you do want to try and expand that a little bit. We'd often look if kids have very restricted textures. So if you have children who even at 4, 5, and 6 are still on purees, we'd need to look at what's going on around, maybe is there issues with muscles in the mouth, what's causing that. I would also say this causes huge stress for families. So for me, if you have maybe a child is actually hitting nutrition needs, it's not very restricted and textures aren't too restricted, but there's huge stress in the family, well, we need to help there because mental health for everybody is going to be important. If it's interfering with normal family life, but also if the child is stressed, because lots of kids I've worked with this themselves, when they're older kids, they're like, well, I want to be able to eat what everybody's having in school. I want to be able to kind of, build that in and be like everybody else. So sometimes with kids, actually that can be an effective way in terms of helping them to overcome it. So where would I start? The big thing I'd often say, and I worked in a pediatric clinic for a few years, and very often when kids came into me for fussy eating, they actually weren't fussy eaters at all. The problem was they weren't hungry. And this is a classic one. And I'd say 50 to 60% of kids I've worked with, the problem was actually just not hungry rather than a fussy eater. And how does this happen? It happens when they've too many snacks in between meals or too many meals through the day. The classic one I would see would be the child who would go to the creche and they're really well looked after in the creche, really well fed. They get their breakfast, they get a snack, they get their lunch, they get a snack, they get their dinner. And then they come home and they've had all the food they need for the day, but then the parents want to have dinner with them. But the child is just too full. They're just not hungry. And so they don't eat their dinner. And this is, again, where you hear parents going, well, they eat broccoli in the creche, but they don't eat it when I give them for dinner at home, or they eat this in the creche, and they don't eat it at home. Very often the child is just full. They've just had enough in the day that they're not going to eat dinner when they come home. Kids, especially toddlers, still drinking huge amounts of milk. I would see lots, where you have kids still having at the age of 3, 5 or 6 bottles of milk a day. And if they're so full up on milk, they are not going to be hungry to eat food. So reducing the milk is going to be important. but also exercise. You know, if kids are driven everywhere, if it's bad weather and you're not getting outside, you know, if they're not getting to run around, and this is even for toddlers right through to your 8, 9, 10-year-olds, they need to get exercise. The most amazing thing is to actually run the legs off them if you can, get them out, get them for a swim, get them for a long walk in the park, go to the playground, but really push them exercise and create an appetite. So the child is actually hungry. And I'm sure you know yourselves, there's foods you mightn't be terribly interested in, but the day you're really hungry, you're like, actually, I really want that. And that's nice. And I'll eat anything because I'm starving. So sometimes you need to create the appetite for the kids. And so the advice I'd give to parents just to check, and this is always the first thing to check, is that you're going to set meal and snack times. All right. Now, it's not rigid. It's not to the minute. But the reason you want to do that is because you want to know breakfast is this time, lunch is this time, dinner is this time. There's no snacks within 2 hours of the next meal. So that means that if dinner is at 6 o'clock, there are no snacks for 2 hours before, because a trend I've seen in the last sort of 15 years is this grazing, these snack foods for children, which they don't need. And this grazing, and people are thinking, well, I'm giving them fruit, it's very healthy, or I'm giving them rice cakes and so on, but they're filling up. Children's tummies are small, and you might think, well, I'm giving them healthy food, it's grand, but actually by the time they sit down to dinner, they're not going to be hungry. So no snacks for 2 hours before meals. So it just gives them time to actually, you know, develop an appetite. I'd also say no drinks 1 hour before meals, not even water. So again, you just want the tummy nice and empty. Now, if we get into like 40-degree heat and you need to give them drinks so they're not dehydrated, please do that. But for typical Irish weather, just if they're looking for drinks, you know, try and give them drinks beforehand, because you know there's going to be a 1 hour sort of ban on drinks, and just depends on the child. And the other thing I'd say as well, when you sit down to meals, don't offer a child a drink straight away, food first and then a drink. If they're really thirsty, try and hang on till halfway through the meal. But if you find they're really thirsty, try and give them drinks earlier in the day. My thing, and certainly with my own kids, and I've 2 kids, I wouldn't even put a glass or a cup out until their food was eaten. And then when they were finished eating, then offer them a drink. Because I learned certainly with one of my kids, he'd sit down, have a big glass of milk and he'd drink it. And then his food would come out, he'd be like, not hungry. So we learned to take that away. And that actually makes a huge difference to kids as well. Sometimes kids are just showing independence, and this is where you have your 2-year-old who was eating everything, and then around the age of 2 just turned into this big fussy eater. And you know, it can be a few things, but a lot of it is showing independence. It's starting to want to make a few decisions for themselves. It's kind of a psychological change for the kids, and we often talk about it as the terrible twos, because they're really, you know, their stubbornness, I suppose, comes in a little bit. This is actually kind of an easier one to handle. And the trick with this one is, generally what you get is you get the child who's been eating everything, and then they sit down and they're usually 2.5, and dinner comes on the table and there's sweet corn, and they go, well, I'm not eating sweet corn. And they've eaten sweet corn up to now, like, I don't like it, I'm not eating it. The way to handle it is to go, that's fine. But you don't stop giving them sweet corn, you just keep giving it to them, because after a couple of weeks, they'll actually just start eating it again if you don't react, if you don't do anything, if you just, that's fine, don't eat sweet corn today, it's grand, but you know, and that's all you have to say, that's fine. Where it becomes an issue is where the dinner comes down and the child goes, I'm not eating sweet corn, and the parent goes, you're eating that, I made that, you ate it last week, you do like it, I know you like it, and there's a big drama about it. And the drama, sometimes for a lot of kids, they quite like that attention. And it's not that they're mean or bad or bold, but it's interesting to them from a developmental point of view that they can actually drive their parents crazy. And if you start with the row, then it actually really reinforces, I'm not eating sweet corn, and it becomes this battle of wills, and kids can be surprisingly stubborn. And you never want to get to the stage where you're forcing food into a child or anything like that. So the trick here is just to do nothing with it. If you miss that, and a lot of parents do, it happens. I would just say try and avoid rows. You'll hear me say this a lot. It's not always possible. The other thing around the age of 2 is kids start to notice what their parents are eating, and they want to copy their parents. So if you have a fussy eating parent, it's quite common for kids to start avoiding the same foods once they start to pay attention to that. So unfortunately, the trick there is to get the fussy eating parent to eat the vegetables or the fish or whatever it is you want them to eat. That's always a funny session when you're talking to the 2 parents and the fussy one is like, I really don't want to do this. But they generally do. The other thing is to try and eat with children as much as possible, because again, they are learning by watching you. And, you know, very often, and I see this with a lot of parents, is they will give the particularly toddler their dinner in the high chair and then go off and sort of be around the kitchen, but they're not eating. The child is eating completely on their own. And eating is very social for humans. We're very social animals. And even if you can sit down and have a cup of tea and a biscuit with the child, sit and eat. But if you can bring them to the table as much as you can, even if it's only at weekends that you can do it, but let them see everybody eating, let them see what the adults are eating. And often kids will be inspired to try stuff from somebody else's plate that they wouldn't have eaten if you handed it up to them. This is always a fun one. Are they super tasters? So super tasters are people who have about 5 times more taste buds on their tongue compared to everybody else. And it's around, looking at studies, around 1 in 4. So these are people who for food just tastes much more intense. So it's a much more intense sensation from taste when they eat it. And the ones that stand out tend to be the bitter flavors, which is your green vegetables, and citrus. So the sour and bitter flavors really stand out for people who have this. And what you'll actually find, and where you'll spot it, is that, you know, where I've had parents come in and say they're a fussy eater, they don't eat, and they're kind of saying, well, they're actually eating things like sweet corn and carrots and stuff, or you know, stuff with funny textures, mushrooms and so on, but they don't eat green, they don't eat citrus, they don't like vinegar on anything, they don't like pickled, and that's often where you've got your super taster. And to be honest, is not a problem, because your super tasters generate absolutely loads of other vegetables. So from a nutrition point of view, they're rarely missing out on anything. So actually it's usually fine. Now, on the other side, you'll actually, with some super tasters, if they had huge exposure to foods as a baby, actually tend to really like all those flavors and actually tend to have a broader palate. So it can really be 2 ends of the extreme with it. So you can encourage these kids to try foods. They will learn the taste of them if they want, but I tend not to worry too much about this group. The other fun one is a bit of just a slowdown. You know, if you look at babies and how rapidly they grow in the first year and the amount of food they consume to actually fuel that, and even up to about 14, you know, to 18 months. But around that time, their growth slows down. It doesn't stop, they keep growing, but not as fast. And so it's normal for their appetite to just take a dip. Now, not to crash, that's a different thing, but if it just takes a dip and suddenly they're not finishing as much dinner as they did, or they're not eating as often, but that's actually quite normal. And it's just for parents I think a lot of people don't know that. They don't know that there can be a small dip in appetite around that age, and they'll generally pick back up again, you know, as they start running around a bit more and moving, the appetite will naturally come back up. So how do we actually manage it? So for me, ground rules are always going to be important for this. And I would say these are what we call ideal guidelines, and then there's the steps you might take to get there. So, you know, for me, when I'm working with families with this, everyone in the family eats the same meals at meal times. This idea of having one set of meal over here and another meal over there, it's very rare that you do it. I often joke, one of my kids would have been a very fussy eater if his mother wasn't a dietitian. And when I talk about kids having 5 foods they don't like, he absolutely hates mincemeat. And it's actually a pain, because it's spaghetti bolognese or homemade burgers or shepherd's pie. Like, there's a lot of things you make with mincemeat he will not. So at this stage, at the age he is now, like, fair enough, doesn't eat mincemeat. So if we are having a mincemeat meal, because I haven't banned it from the family menu, he will make, because he's old enough now, he's 12, so he'll fry an egg for himself, or he'll cook a chicken breast or something, but he does it himself because I'm not doing it. To be honest, I'm not cooking 2 meals. And that's his one let off. And I think for kids, what I see happen quite often is you have the child who dinner was handed up and they might have hated it, but it wasn't their favorite dinner. And then they're like, I'm not eating that. But then the parent goes, oh God, they didn't eat. They're going to die of starvation. We eat chicken nuggets and chips. And the child goes, oh hell yeah, I'll eat chicken nuggets and chips. And what they've learned is, if I don't like the meal, or if it's not my favorite meal, if I kick up a bit of a fuss or I refuse it, I'm going to get my really favorite meal. And that's where I end up with kids in the clinic who are eating chicken nuggets and chips every day. And it's not that they were particularly fussy to begin with, they just learned that refusing something got me this. So the idea is that whatever's going, and you can do the chicken nuggets and chips once a week or whatever, but on the other days, you know, and as I've often explained even to my own kids, you don't get your favorite meal every day. Because we're not, you know, no matter what size your family is, it's unusual that all of you are going to have the same favorite meal. So it goes on rotation. Now, I'd say that's ideal. In real life, if you have a child who's very fussy and they're eating the one thing for dinner, you're going to do that on a Monday, where the dinner just gets put in front of them on a Monday, and then they can have their other dinners the rest of the week. And then as things progress, you can move along with it. So you don't want to sort of take all of their favorite foods out in one go and have, because you will, it's a headache for everybody. But on the day that they're getting the same meal as everyone else, they don't get a substitute. That's the dinner, take it or leave it. And if they happen to go to bed hungry that night, they'll actually be fine. Like, if they're doing that, going to bed, and they're not eating for 3 or 4 days, you know, different story. But if they've had their breakfast, their lunch, their dinner, their snacks in the day, and they don't eat dinner, I wouldn't be worrying about it. So you wait till the next meal. And this is, again, where having set meal and snack times is helpful. You know, if they don't eat their lunch, that's fine. Lunch is done. Well, then you have your snack at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, or whatever way you're doing it. And just to do, you don't argue. You just go, this is the meal. And they go, I'm not eating that. And you go, that's fine. And that's the end. But that's the hard part, actually. Now, I'm going to talk to you about the new foods technique, because it's a quite a nice way to get kids more familiar with foods. And one of the things for a child who's a very fussy eater, there's usually two issues. They're not familiar with the food. And not just in terms of the taste of it, but the feel of it in their mouth can be very odd if they're not used to it. But even the smell of it, the look of it, like there's a lot more to food than just the taste of it. And so what this does is it helps to break down what we call barriers. A lot of kids are nearly like, I'm not even going to touch that. Don't put that near me. I don't know if you have that kid, because that's actually quite, hard to deal with. So what we do with this, it's based on the fact that it takes the body 10 to 16 goes to like a new food. And this is the same for adults as well as children. If any of you are watching have a fussy of a food you absolutely hate that nearly makes you want to gag, if you actually keep eating that about 16 times, you'll actually start to be able to eat it. What we think is going on is that when a food is unfamiliar, your body actually just assumes it's poisonous. So it's just like, get that out, don't put that near me. You have this intense, really intense desire from the body to get the food out. But if you keep eating very small amounts of it, but just do it for a few weeks, the body eventually kind of goes, well, she's eaten this and she's still not dead. So obviously it's not poisonous, and it nearly relaxes and resets, and the body learns how to actually accept the food. And I always remember doing this myself with shellfish. And I've been doing this kind of versions of this talk for years, and talking about bringing in and trying new foods. And I was there one day going, I absolutely, thoughts of shellfish used to just make me want to just really not be well. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. So I remember the first time I ate a prawn. I have to say, if I hadn't been in a restaurant, I would have spat it straight on the floor. It was horrific. But anyway, got it down, swallowed it, that was fine. And I went at it. It actually took me about 6 months. But after 6 months, I could eat the prawns. And then, within a year, I was eating all kinds of shellfish, scallops, mussels, clams, the whole 9 yards. But these days, I even cook it. And it's just incredible to me that I have gone from being someone who would have nearly gotten sick at the thought of eating shellfish to really enjoying it and really, really liking it. So we can learn to do this. And what you do with the kids is you're not going to sit down and force feed them prawns. The way to do it is you take a small amount of whatever the food is you want them to try. Now, if they're old enough to chat to you about this and agree, that really helps. They say, well, okay, well, I will try carrots, or we can try this, or whatever it is to start with. So we'll just pretend we're going to do carrots, and you just take a small bit. Like, don't give them a whole plate of carrots. You give them one small piece of carrot on a side plate. So not on their plate, it's beside them on the table. And you just give it to them and you say nothing, right? You don't go, there's a bit of carrot, or try that, or that's delicious, or you just put it down. There's no comment, there's no talking. And the child is not going to go near it. The first 5 or 6 times you do that, they're not going to go near it. After around 5 or 6 times, they'll often touch it. And around 8 to 10 times, they might pick it up and squash it. Around 10 times, they might touch it to their lips, which is actually quite a sensory, very sensitive part. So they'll touch it. And then after about 10 to 16 goes, they might take a little nibble, okay? And the reason this tends to happen, now it doesn't work with every child, but I 70 to 80% of kids I've worked with, we find this works nicely, because what you're doing is you're taking the whole drama out of the eating. And there's usually a lot of drama by the time someone is actually coming to see a dietitian for fussy eating. So it just takes all the drama, all the fuss, all the rows, all the pressure out of the whole thing. And the child can just start to relax and learn the food that has nothing to do with the dynamic that might have been going on for a while. And as I said earlier, we learn about food from the look of it. So although the child is sitting there with this piece of carrot beside them for 5 dinners in a row and they haven't done anything, but they're looking at it, it's now closer to them, they're feeling a little bit safer about it. When they touch it, that's brilliant. They're kind of like, okay, we can touch this, it's okay. And then as each bit by bit, they're getting used to the feel of it on their fingers, on their lip, in their mouth, the taste, and so on from there. So, but the trick all the time is to say absolutely nothing. Even when they touch it, sometimes the temptation is to jump up and go, oh my God, you touched it. And I remember working with one 3-year-old, and her mum rang me at about 7 o'clock one evening. She put it to her mouth, she touched her lips with it, and she was laughing. She said, I had to tell somebody. She said, I was dying to praise the child, and I knew I wasn't supposed to. And we just had such a laugh over it, but it was literally, she just touched her mouth. But it was really good, and it just breaks down those barriers, because you'll see a lot of kids often are just really against food totally. And you can do this with a few different foods. You can work on one at a time. I would say if you are a fussy eater yourself, or if there's a food you hate yourself, this is wonderful for you to do at the same time as the child, because the kids get a huge laugh out of this. And we started doing this in the last 3 or 4 years, and it's just hilarious, because particularly with kids who are like 6, 7, 8, like they know how horrible it feels to eat this food, and then the parent is trying, and they feel like they're in it together, and they can both be going yuck together, and they can both be trying it, and it becomes a bit of a game, and actually it works quite well. So it's a night, if you have a fussy eating kid, and there's a food you hate and they know you hate, because the kids usually do, it's a fun one to go with. Now, don't do this with food you're allergic to or anything like that, but just if there's food you hate. So some of the other things to look at with it, and I talk about these as table techniques, and it's funny ways just getting kids to do stuff. So dipping stuff, a lot of toddlers and young children love the mess of dipping. That's why chips dipped in ketchup are really popular. But you can actually try lots of different mixes. So things like yogurt, pureed fruit, yogurt and pureed fruit mixed together, smooth peanut butter blended in with yogurt, and a couple, you'll see recipes online for that, can be really, really good for kids just trying different foods. Cottage cheese, bit of ketchup won't do them any harm. Do make sure it's gluten-free. Cream cheese, but often you get vegetable sticks, fruit sticks, any random thing, and they're just dipping in and out. And especially if there's other kids kind of around, I know with COVID it's all a bit strained at the moment, but just that sort of playing with food, get their hands on it and get messy. Spreading stuff as well, and again, you're not expecting the child to eat this. This is the thing about this technique, but they are handling the food. So it's a bit like doing art, only with food. And so you might get, you know, gluten-free bread, crackers, toast, things like that. But also apple slices can be quite good for this. But what's happening is, as they're handling the food and the spread and all, it's getting on their hands. So they're getting the touch of it, and they'll often end up licking their fingers or something as they go. So they're actually getting the taste, but without you talking about them eating it. So you might just say, can you help me with this? Can you do this? You don't even have to say you don't have. They say, I'm not eating it. You go, that's okay. I just want you to spread it on, or to do that. And you're kind of tricking them into trying it, but it does work quite well. Serving foods in funny ways actually goes a long way. You know, I've had great success when we start putting chicken curry in ice cream cones, of all things, because it's just, kids are like, that's just curious, that's different, that's new, it looks really weird, and I'm going to try it. So, you know, the ice cream cones actually are hilarious. I mean, people think, you know, curry and ice cream cone, actually it's great. You know, gluten-free taco shells, measuring cups, just random dishes in the house that you'd never normally serve food in. You know, you can get wine glasses, and I've often used kind of the plastic picnic ones, they're not breaking them, but just that you're serving dinner, because they might even see dessert in funny glasses like that, but your dinner doesn't usually turn up in that way, so it can be quite good. And even just different shapes of foods works as well. We talk about phone friend. I don't know if you've had the experience of kids who won't eat something in your house but will eat it when they've gone over to their friend's house. And peer pressure is very this positive kind of peer pressure is great. So I'd often link up with a friend. Most people have kids that they'd like them to eat something different, and I kind of just say, well, sure, bring them over to my house. I'll do it for dinner, or, you know, vice versa. And that can actually work really quite well with that. The other one to watch and is to look at whether or not they're actually comfortable. Because very often we put kids, when they're in the high chair, their feet are supported. If you have a look at most high chairs, there's a little foot support. So the child is sitting with their feet supported. And you actually need to do that, because if your feet aren't supported, you're actually going to be a bit wobbly in your chair. If you've ever had the experience of sitting on a bar stool where there was nowhere to put your feet, it's actually quite weird. You go looking for somewhere to rest your feet because you actually don't feel balanced and steady. But you see, the kids come out of their high chair and they go into the normal family chairs, which are adult sized, and suddenly their feet are swinging. And we think this is normal and cute and it's all very nice, but actually for stability, it can be quite difficult. And that's why one of the things that actually works quite well if you have a fussy eating kid is to put a box under their feet so they actually have a solid surface to put their feet on. So if you have a child who's sitting in a chair and their legs are swinging, you'd be surprised. Actually, it's great for homework as well, or anything like that. They're easier for them to write if they're actually really well balanced all the way through. So it's one of the reasons why kids eat better at creche than at home, because they actually have the proper size chair. Their feet are solidly on the ground. And that's a really quick one just to try out for yourself. Other techniques to get kids eating is cooking and growing food. And cooking is fantastic. And again, they don't have to eat what they cook, but what they do need to do is cook. And the reason that is they're handling the food. And it's back to what I keep saying is you got to get familiar with the food even before you eat it. So if you can get a child who'll tear up lettuce leaves for you, who might throw tomatoes in a bowl, who might mix it, and sometimes get them in with their hands, like you can wash their hands and get them to mix a salad dressing in. You know, as they get a little bit older and you can give them a knife to chop up. There is a great company called Kids Cook. I think it's Kids Cook, cookingclub.ie, but they have really kiddie cuts knives, and the knives will actually cut food, but they don't cut fingers. So they're actually fantastic for younger children. And the idea, again, they're handling the food, they're touching it, they'll stick it in their mouth bit by bit. I've certainly worked with I think of one family, and the child was really struggling, but they actually cooked the same recipe every week for a year, and at the end of the year then decided to eat it, and then it became another food for them. So this can take a long time, but the more they're handling food, it breaks down barriers. And, you know, I don't even get them watching cooking programs. A lot of kids are a bit fussy when they see something cooked. or they might see recipes and I think, actually, I'll try that. And it's just about generating sort of a familiarity with food, getting them into the supermarket and picking up the stuff for you. So if you have a child who won't eat vegetables, maybe in the supermarket, you'll say, will you pick up that broccoli and put it in the basket? Will you pick up those carrots and put them in the basket? And even that is just breaking down any barriers around the food with it. You know, so just those are great. Growing stuff as well. Herbs grown on a windowsill, peas are remarkably easy to grow, and kids will often eat something they've grown, or they'll eat something that's made with something they've grown, just because it's a little bit different for them. I've had kids who will eat peas raw off the pod, in the back garden, who would never eat them if they turned up on their dinner plate. So, you know, these things can really be helpful. Now, I'm just going to mention at the end a type of eating disorder, which is called ARFID. So it's a great mouthful. It's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And this is what I would call very, very severe food restriction. These are the children who do end up with nutrition deficiencies, and in some rare cases will end up being permanently tube fed because they just have such restriction around food. It's more common in children and adults who are autistic, but certainly not confined to that. And it can result from lots of things. I don't know if any of you are familiar with sensory processing disorder. And what that is where, if you think about someone who we hear at a normal level, and then you have some people who have really sensitive hearing, and noises that you and I might notice will actually be really intense for them. And it's just the brain processes the signal at kind of a higher level. So that's for hearing. But you might then, if they process the touch signal at a higher level, well, then the feel of the food in the mouth can actually be very intense, to the point where children just want smooth things because the intensity of that sensory signal is huge. Same for taste. If you have a really intense taste, will be in there. So, you know, I often look, if you have kids who would be cutting all the labels off their clothes, there's certain clothes they actually can't stand, children who hate wearing socks, things like that. Often signs there might just be some sensory issues there, and an occupational therapist actually is brilliant for diagnosing that, and just giving some help and assistance with it. You can get ARFID with children who have had a bad choking incident and they're just terrified to eat again. So there you might look with a psychologist who's got experience with it to help children just to overcome their fear of eating. We mentioned things like illness or vomiting. Usually doesn't become like the usual, you know, gastric bug. Most kids are fine. But there's lots and lots of things for it. But this is quite severe. These are children who are really, you know, these are the children who actually starve. If you didn't give them the food they wanted, they actually will not eat for 2 or 3 days. And that's where you're looking at a child who really has something else going on, where even hunger isn't going to get them to eat. And so you'd often need a good team in there. You might need to look at a dietitian, occupational therapist. Sometimes children have issues just with their muscles and how their tongue works to actually move food around. A thing you might see sometimes is a child who looks like they're just chewing and chewing and chewing and chewing for a huge length of time. And you're thinking, how can they still be chewing that? But the actual, what's going on there is they're having difficulty rolling the food into a ball with their tongue, which is what you need to do before you swallow it. And so they're just trying and trying to get it to the shape needed to swallow. To you and me, it looks like they're chewing, but you know, good speech and language therapist will actually spot what's going on with that and can give exercises to help. So there's lots of reasons kids can really be very slow eaters or have difficulty with it. But this is something that you'd need to get sort of diagnosed with specialists with it. It's very rare. It does happen and it's very rare, but you know, very often, you know, I've worked with a lot of autistic kids as well, and you know, you can get an awful lot of variety in. It's slow, but it just the specific need of the child just depends on what's causing the problem in the first place. So how do you get started? I would keep saying this, in most cases, fussy eating is no harm. Most kids do grow out of it. It tends to peak around the age of 6 and then fall away again. And if nothing has happened by the time they're 16, as soon as they start going out for dinner and hanging out with their friends, a lot of them start to eat a lot of other foods because they don't want to be the odd person out. It definitely takes time to improve. I would say, though, the earlier you move to fix fussy eating, the faster. You know, if I've worked with, I remember working with 11-month-old twins and we sorted out the problem in a week. You work with a 2-year-old, you're talking 3 months. By the time you're talking to a 3-year-old, you're probably looking at 9 months. By the time you're looking at a 6, 7, 8-year-old, it's easily a year to get it sorted out. So, you know, the earlier you can sort of just look for some help with it, the better. It can be hard to get help. I know lots of parents have kind of gone many times looking for help and have had difficulties. So, but it's okay if your child's not a perfect eater. Now, I know most of the people that I would see, the kids really do have issues, but you know, a lot of people think, well, if they don't eat absolutely everything, that they're a fussy eater. And you're like, no, they can have 5 or 6 foods, or, you know, depending on what they're eating, a bit more that they don't like. The thing I'd always say to parents is they'll really remember that fussy eating is not bad behavior. because a lot of parents get so angry with the children, and it's, you know, it's natural. And believe me, I've had the days myself with my kids. You know, we all talk about being this perfect parent, but look, we all have our moments, and it's so tempting to row with kids about food, and you just have to just try not to, because the child isn't actually doing it on purpose to annoy you most of the time. And even if they are, it came out of something else. So they're not doing it on purpose. If they are really gagging when they eat food, they genuinely have a body that's going, don't give this to me. And it's difficult to overcome it. And again, that's why I always say to people, do it yourself if there's a food you hate, because then you'll actually understand what your child is going through. And I'd also say to parents, go easy on yourself. There is so much pressure around, you know, child nutrition and eating and so on. Like we were talking even at back to school, and there's fantastic advice about back to school. And we've actually really good stuff on our website at the moment. But you know, the kids don't have to go to school with this perfect lunch and people under pressure. You know, they just need to, we tend to be putting ourselves under a lot of pressure with it. And I would say it is very stressful for families. So I would look for help if it's really becoming a thing where every meal is an absolute stress. You know, sometimes just take a step back. If nutritionally they're kind of doing okay, give yourself a couple of weeks or a couple of months. I would never tackle fussy eating in a child if you had a whole lot of other things going on, you know, if work was very stressful, or, you know, that kind of way, that you have to be sort of a little bit ready so that you're calm when it happens. So thank you for joining today. I hope that you found that interesting. I have a couple of questions up here in the chat. So if anybody wants to add any more questions, please feel free. I was just going to say, someone has said here, my son has a very limited diet and he gags at the thought of putting food near his mouth. So that's quite a classic thing where kids are just not familiar with foods. Again, there could be lots of reasons. It could be maybe he was unfamiliar with a lot of the foods, maybe when he was very young. We kind of have a window up to about 18 months to get kids to eat a lot of things. But again, maybe sensory issues could be in there. You know, if he's one of those kids who's talking about labels and doesn't like socks and all of those kind of things. So the new foods technique can be quite useful there. But also, depending on his age, is he willing to try even just touching new foods, touching them in the supermarket? So rather than think about putting food in his mouth, just even getting him to touch it, look at it, smell it, can actually be quite helpful. My little one is 18 months old and regularly refuses foods both at home and in creche. She'll eat ready bread and Weetabix, Greek yogurt with fruit pouches. She also eats cheddar cheese slices, yogurts, and occasionally eggs and mashed potato with mashed carrots and salmon. But that's it. She won't entertain anything new, and even when she sees something new, will refuse. We cook every evening, but she feels she's just not getting enough. She's a fairly good variety of foods in there. Like I'm looking at, she's getting protein, she's getting you know, fiber, she's getting calcium. You know, it's not the end of the world. Yeah, it'd be lovely if she had loads of veg in. Some of the things that I spoke about just already, about just putting new foods on a plate. At 18 months old, you know, let her get her hands into food. So even the food that she is liking, I don't know if she's feeding herself at the moment, but giving her a spoon, let her even just use her fingers, even if it's a bit of a mess. It's actually quite good for kids to do that and to get a good mess going with things. So try those different techniques with her and she's the right age to be a bit fussy with this. But I would give her those foods, but just maybe once in a while, give her a meal that's not her favorite meal and see how she gets on with it, or just one or two foods on the plate with it. And you can even try playing a game about, I'll take a bite, you'll take a bite, things like that. I know with one of my kids, we used to play a game called Cheese Bribery. I'm not recommending this as an official food technique, but he used to love cheese. And what we used to do is I'd hold up the cheese, he'd open his mouth, I'd pop in the food I wanted him to eat. He'd give me a dirty look, but he'd chew it and swallow it, and then he'd get the cheese. And we did that a few times. And I was doing that to get him over, you know, textures and different foods like that. Now, as I said, I'm not saying it's official, but you're looking at different ways just to get them interested in foods as well. And it's more just now and again, just give her a meal that is not her. Now, don't give her food she hates, but it's kind of, that's dinner and she can take it or leave it. And a great time to do that is when she is really, really hungry. I worked with some twins a few years ago and they would never eat anything. They used to graze all day long. And so what we did was we took them out of this grazing and snacking, put in the meal schedules and popped them into their high chair where they were eating. And they just wouldn't eat because they didn't eat in the high chair, and they weren't eating this dinner because they wanted the kind of snack things that they had all the time. And we actually went a whole day and they had a couple of snacks in it, but they didn't eat very much. But it was funny because the next morning they were taking them out for a walk and they were going off to feed the ducks. But by the time the kids had got to the ducks, they'd actually eaten all the bread. And it was the same bread they'd refused to eat for breakfast, but they just got hungry, with that. So it's just sometimes building up hunger. And I suppose for me, I always remember one day I decided I was going to try this new recipe, these aduki bean burgers. And I thought, we're going to try these are going to be great. And I thought, I'm going to make sure my kids eat them. So I took them out to the park in the morning. We had about a 2-hour walk around the park and the playground and all the rest, had our lunch, then we went for a swim. So by the time it came to dinner, they were absolutely starving, and they sat down and they murdered these Aduki bean bars. Like, Mum, this is amazing. These are gorgeous. My husband and I are sitting there pushing this purple sludge around their plate. They were dreadful, but the kids were so hungry that they actually cleared the whole lot of them. And sometimes just creating that hunger, really getting them physically active, can actually, just the hunger can overrule them and make them eat. So there are things to try as well. What vitamins would you recommend for 8 and 11? The 8-year-old has ADHD and ASD. To be honest, with vitamins for kids, I mean, there's a couple of general multivitamins out there, but it's kind of useful just to see what they might be missing. Generally, I'd have a look at what they're eating first, and from there we'd see what they might be missing out on. I mean, there's a couple of brands out there. Well Kid are quite good. You'll see, I mean, there's lots of, what I'd say, if you're looking for multivitamins for children, just read the label, make sure they've a little bit of everything, because sometimes the multivitamins has 2 vitamins in it. So you want something that has a bit, and particularly look for something with vitamin D with it. But again, I'd really need to see what their diet was to have a look with that. Now, a few more over here. So we have an extreme fussy eater and gone so long and tried so many things, afraid to push in case it makes the issue worse. Well, I mean, that's quite normal, where you finally have the child on some sort of even keel eating something and you're afraid to push it. So again, I agree with you. I wouldn't be going in to have a row or a fight or anything with that. But that's where the new food technique, again, you're just putting a little bit on a side plate. It's not on their plate where they might just freak out with it. It's just coming in there with it. And again, I would have a go at cooking and growing food with that. So they're touching and learning other ways with it, and just to give that a go as well. What are your thoughts on this approach? My 4-year-old won't eat his dinner, wants yummy snacks instead. Oh, yeah. We just leave the dinner and normally don't give him alternative before bed. 30% of the time he will eat some of the dinner, other nights he won't. It's ruining our evenings. An odd night I've given him alternatives like toast. I think you're doing exactly the right thing. Chances are, if he's 4 years of age, have a look at what he might be eating during the day as well, because if he's still growing well and he's in good form generally, and he's meeting all his milestones, he's probably getting enough food. So it might be just the case that by the time we get to dinner, he's just not hungry. So I would do just a smaller portion of dinner and no alternatives. So, when he has his dinner and he's going to bed, that would be absolutely fine. Like, sometimes, I know we often talk about parents years ago saying, well, if you don't eat it now, you're getting it for breakfast in the morning. I'm not suggesting you do that, but just keep it handy and just say, look, if you're hungry, there it is. Because it's what I'd often say even to my kids when they were 8 and 9 is like the apple test. Like, well, can I have something to eat? And you go, have an apple. If I don't want an apple, let's go, well, then you're not hungry. You're kind of, I know I'm a very mean dietitian, Mammy, but I think you're doing exactly the right thing. But what I'd say to you, stop letting it ruin your evening, because it's fine. If he doesn't want to eat his dinner, it's fine. He's obviously getting enough food in the rest of the day. If he's growing, if everything else is fine, he's well and healthy and in good form, and his height and everything is going, and he's eating well through the rest of the day, I wouldn't be too worried about him only picking at dinner. 4-year-olds actually don't need very much food. I mean, they only need less than half, even less than what an adult would need for food through the day. So it's, something I'd say to you, your job here is to actually, if you can, just breathe and just say, there's dinner, and he goes, I'm not eating that, and you go, that's fine, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Certainly what I've done with kids is that they don't have to eat the dinner, but they do have to stay at the table, and it's not a torture thing, it's actually to family interact. And very often where we've done that, the child ends up picking a little bit at the dinner just because they're sitting there. I'd never push it past 30 minutes, but I think it's good, just again from the social side of eating, for the child to sit with mum and dad and everybody else in the family and have the conversation, so that they associate eating with that lovely social connection as well as with the food. So maybe just, he's 4, he's not going to sit for long, but even just to sit with you for a little while and eat or not, because I'd say he's fine. Grand, I think, is that all of them? Yep, I think that's all of our questions. So is anybody else, anything else they want to ask? Okay, well, look, thank you very much for coming today, and thank you to Shar for sponsoring this talk today. All of you will have had an email that's with a link in it, so you'll be able to get some free gifts from Shar for yourselves after that. And look, if you have any other questions, you can always get in touch with us at info@celiac.ie. Thank you very much for joining today. Bye-bye.